Rick Hansen sat in the dimly lit, industrial-style bar, downing another glass of the potent liquor that the locals called Zareth. It burned like liquid fire as it traveled down his throat, but it was a familiar heat, one that reminded him of home, Earth. He leaned back, glancing out the transparent walls that overlooked the bustling city of Xantra, one of the core worlds in the Zarnath Alliance. "Another drink?" the alien bartender asked. Her voice was low, almost a hiss, as her scaly hands refilled Rick's glass. She had been watching him with curiosity ever since he walked in, a lone human among the Zarnathians, a species known for their meticulous caution and precise, methodical approach to life. "Sure," Rick replied with a lazy grin. "Might as well get a good buzz going before I head out." The bartender tilted her head, her violet eyes narrowing. "Where is it you're going, human? There's a storm brewing out there. Not exactly the time to be out exploring." Rick smirked, tapping a finger on the glass. "I've got a job. Special request, you know? Seems like nobody else was crazy enough to take it." She glanced around the bar, lowering her voice. "Is it true what they say? That humans, the Deathworlders, you actually thrive on danger?" Rick shrugged, but his eyes twinkled with amusement. "Something like that." The conversation was interrupted as a group of military officers entered the bar, their armored uniforms gleaming in the dim light. Their leader, a towering figure with red skin and deep-set eyes, approached Rick with a datapad in hand. "Rick Hansen?" the officer asked, his tone more skeptical than respectful. "That's me." Rick finished his drink and set the glass down, standing up with a nonchalant stretch. The officer handed Rick the datapad, his expression unreadable. "You're cleared for the mission. I hope you understand the gravity of the situation." Rick glanced at the datapad, swiping through the details with disinterest. Yeah. Dangerous mission, high stakes, radiation everywhere, blah, blah, blah." He flashed the officer a grin. "Sounds like fun." The officer's expression darkened. "This is not a game, human. The reactor on the desolate moon of Epsilon 7 is leaking antimatter radiation. Every second we waste could result in the entire facility collapsing in on itself, causing a catastrophic chain reaction that could obliterate the surrounding star systems." Rick simply nodded, unfazed. "No pressure then." As they exited the bar, the officer struggled to hide his disbelief. "Do you even comprehend the risks? Every other species we contacted declined, none were willing to volunteer. And yet, your kind, signed up in droves. Why?" Rick paused, glancing at the officer, his grin widening. "Because we've got nothing better to do." 2 hours later, Rick was seated in the shuttle heading toward Epsilon 7, the bleak and desolate moon where the reactor incident had occurred. Around him, the shuttle was filled with a mix of alien scientists and military personnel, all of whom looked tense. Rick, however, remained calm, as if this were just another day at the office. "Is it true what they say about your people?" one of the scientists, a pale-skinned, multi-limbed Kidhar, asked nervously. "That you humans are immune to fear?" Rick chuckled, leaning back in his seat. "Nah, we're just good at ignoring it." The shuttle's descent was rough, the atmosphere of the moon barely existing, and the gravitational pull lighter than most worlds. As they approached the landing zone, Rick could see the wreckage of the facility from the viewport. Twisted metal, glowing debris, and pockets of shimmering antimatter particles were scattered across the moon's surface, creating an eerie, otherworldly landscape. "Here we go," Rick muttered, standing up as the shuttle landed with a soft thud. The rest of the team hesitated for a moment, their nerves clearly on edge. But Rick was already moving, strapping on his gear and heading for the exit. "Wait," one of the military officers called after him. "We need to go over the safety protocols first." Rick paused, glancing over his shoulder with a smirk. "Safety protocols? Just don't touch anything glowing, right?" The officer's face paled, but before he could respond, Rick stepped out of the shuttle, his boots crunching against the cracked surface of the moon. The devastation was even worse up close. The reactor's explosion had left behind a massive crater, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with residual energy. Rick glanced at the readouts on his wrist device. Radiation levels were off the charts, and the antimatter particles in the air were enough to turn most species into goo in seconds. But not humans. Rick grinned to himself. Good thing we're tougher than most. The rest of the team cautiously followed him out, their hazard suits thick and cumbersome. Rick, in contrast, moved easily in his lighter gear, his eyes scanning the environment with practiced ease. "This place is a death trap," one of the scientists muttered, his voice trembling. "How can you be so calm?" Rick shrugged. "Been and worse." As they approached the reactor site, Rick could see the source of the antimatter leak. A massive rupture in the core was spewing particles into the air, creating a swirling, dangerous vortex of unstable energy. "All right," Rick said, clapping his hands together. "Let's get this mess cleaned up." The team stared at him, stunned. "How do you propose we do that?" one of the scientists asked incredulously. Rick grinned, pulling out a roll of duct tape from his pack. "We'll start with this." As the team worked to set up their equipment, Rick wandered closer to the swirling antimatter vortex, his eyes gleaming with curiosity. The dark mass pulsed with energy, distorting the space around it, creating ripples in reality itself. "This thing is wild," Rick muttered to himself, leaning in to get a better look. "Stay back," the lead scientist, a frail-looking Zarnathian with silver scales, called out, his voice filled with panic. "One wrong move and you'll be pulled in." Rick chuckled. "Relax. I've got this." Ignoring the scientist's protests, Rick pulled out his handheld scanner, taking readings of the vortex's energy output. His mind raced with ideas, each more dangerous than the last, but that was how humans worked, by pushing the limits. "All right," Rick said, stepping back and turning to the team. "I've got a plan." The lead scientist blinked, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You have a plan? But, how?" Rick grinned. "Easy. We stabilize the vortex with a force field, rigged up with some spare parts and duct tape. Should hold long enough for us to fix the core." The aliens stared at him, their expressions a mix of disbelief and horror. That's insane," one of the military officers exclaimed. Rick shrugged, pulling out more duct tape. "Insane? Maybe. But it's also gonna work." Rick moved quickly, directing the team with an ease that belied the intensity of the situation. The swirling antimatter vortex behind them pulsed ominously, its gravitational field warping the air and space around it. The alien scientists fidgeted nervously, their fingers trembling as they handled the equipment, but Rick remained calm, focused, and seemingly unbothered by the very real possibility of instant disintegration. "All right," Rick said, pulling out a toolkit from his pack, "let's get the emitters in place. We're going to create a temporary force field to stabilize that vortex before it collapses and takes us with it." The lead scientist, Trellick, a Zarnathian with silver scales, glanced nervously between the vortex and Rick. "Are you certain this will work, human? The force field generators weren't designed for such extreme conditions." "And duct tape? This isn't." Rick cut him off with a smirk. "Trellick, you've got to trust me on this one. You aliens are always overthinking everything. Sometimes, the simplest solution is the best one." He slapped the roll of duct tape against the side of a force field emitter and gave it a solid pat. "Good old human ingenuity." Trellick's eyes twitched, but he didn't argue. The alien team members exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unsure whether to place their lives in the hands of the reckless Deathworlder who was apparently treating the whole ordeal like a casual afternoon project. One of the military officers, a towering figure with 6 arms and skin like hardened leather, crossed his limbs and growled, "If this fails, we all die. Do you realize the consequences?" Rick looked up, meeting the officer's gaze with an almost casual intensity. "Yeah, I get it. But if we don't do anything, we're just sitting here waiting to die anyway. So let's stop wasting time and get this field up." The officer grumbled something under his breath but relented, his arms falling to his sides as the alien team got to work. Under Rick's direction, they began assembling the makeshift force field, using a combination of high-tech parts and the duct tape Rick had insisted would hold it all together. As they worked, the sound of the vortex behind them grew louder, a deep, resonating hum that made the very air vibrate with tension. It was like standing next to the edge of a black hole, knowing that one wrong step could send them spiraling into oblivion. "All right, moment of truth," Rick said as he connected the last piece of the field generator. "Let's fire this thing up." Trellick hesitated, his fingers hovering over the control panel. "If we fail to contain it." "We won't fail," Rick interrupted, his voice steady. "Now hit the switch." Trellick took a deep breath and activated the generator. For a moment, nothing happened. The vortex continued to swirl, its gravitational pull growing stronger with every passing second. The ground beneath them began to tremble, and the air seemed to ripple, as if reality itself was on the verge of collapsing. Then, with a sudden hum, the force field flared to life. A shimmering dome of energy enveloped the vortex, its edges crackling with raw power as it fought to contain the unstable antimatter. The alien team collectively held their breath, waiting for the inevitable failure. But as the seconds passed, the vortex began to stabilize. The swirling mass of energy slowed, its gravitational field shrinking as the force field did its job. Rick grinned, wiping his hands on his pants. "Told you. Duct tape saves the day." The alien scientists stared at the containment field in disbelief. One of them, a blue-skinned Dravalian, muttered under his breath, "This shouldn't be possible." "Welcome to the human way," Rick said, flashing them a wink. "Now let's get that reactor core fixed before something else blows up." The team moved quickly, bolstered by the unexpected success of Rick's plan. The force field around the antimatter vortex held steady, giving them just enough time to dismantle the damaged reactor core and prevent a total meltdown. But even with the vortex contained, the environment around them was still highly unstable. Every step they took had to be precise, every calculation double-checked, or they risked triggering another disaster. As Rick and the aliens worked side by side, something strange began to happen. The tension that had been so thick when they first arrived was slowly giving way to a new kind of energy, an unspoken understanding between them. The aliens, who had initially viewed Rick as little more than a reckless fool, were starting to see him in a different light. "Why do you do this?" Trellick asked as he adjusted one of the coolant lines on the reactor core. "Why do your people volunteer for such dangerous missions? It doesn't make sense." Rick paused, wiping the sweat from his brow. He looked up at the swirling vortex, now safely contained behind the force field, and shrugged. "Because somebody has to do it. Might as well be us." Trellick frowned, clearly unsatisfied with the answer. "But why you? Why humans? Other species value their safety, their survival. You seem to thrive on risk." Rick chuckled, shaking his head. "It's not that we don't value survival. It's just that we're used to danger. Earth isn't exactly a safe place, you know? We've had to deal with hurricanes, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, wild animals trying to eat us, and that's before you even get into the crazy stuff we've done to each other. You could say we're desensitized to the idea of dying." The alien scientists around him exchanged uneasy glances, but Trellick's gaze remained fixed on Rick. "Still, I don't understand. There's no reward in this. You risk your life for what?" Rick's grin softened into something more serious, more introspective. "It's not about the reward. It's about proving something, to ourselves and to the rest of the galaxy. We're not just reckless. We're problem solvers. We figure things out, even when the odds are stacked against us. And sometimes, that means taking risks that no one else will." Before Trellick could respond, a loud beeping sound filled the air. One of the military officers cursed, glancing at his wrist-mounted scanner. "The core is about to go critical." "Time's up," Rick muttered, moving quickly toward the reactor. "Get clear. I'll handle this." The team scrambled to get to safety as the reactor began to vibrate violently, the last remnants of its antimatter reserves threatening to ignite. But Rick stayed calm, his hands moving deftly over the control panel, making adjustments with the ease of someone who had done this 100 times before. "Rick!" Trellick called out, his voice filled with panic. "You'll be vaporized if you stay there." Rick didn't look up. His focus was entirely on the reactor. "Not if I fix this first." The temperature in the room skyrocketed as the reactor's containment field began to fail, and the air around Rick shimmered with heat. Sweat poured down his face, but he didn't stop. His fingers danced over the controls, inputting commands at a speed that the aliens could barely follow. For a moment, it seemed like all hope was lost. The reactor core was seconds away from detonating, and even Rick's calm demeanor couldn't hide the danger they were in. But then, with a final keystroke, the reactor powered down. The room went silent.
Rick stepped back, wiping the sweat from his brow as the reactor's hum died away. He turned to the others with a triumphant grin. "And that, my friends, is how you save the day." The relief among the team was palpable. The antimatter leak was contained, the reactor had been stabilized, and for the first time since their arrival, it seemed like they might actually survive. But as they packed up their equipment and prepared to head back to the shuttle, something unexpected happened. Trellick, the Zarnathian scientist who had been the most skeptical of Rick from the start, approached him with a strange look in his eyes. His silver scales shimmered in the dim light, and his posture, once rigid and formal, had softened into something more intimate. "Rick," Trellick said, his voice low and uncertain, "I've never encountered a species like yours. Your courage, your recklessness. It's unlike anything I've ever seen." Rick raised an eyebrow, surprised by the sudden change in Trellick's demeanor. Thanks? I guess we're just wired differently." Trellick stepped closer, his violet eyes glinting with something Rick couldn't quite place. "I find myself drawn to it. To you." Rick blinked, taken aback. "Wait, are you?" Before he could finish, Trellick reached out, brushing a hand against Rick's arm. The contact sent a shiver through Rick's body, and for the first time, he felt a surge of something he hadn't expected. A strange, primal attraction. Rick froze for a moment, unsure of how to respond. The air between him and Trellick seemed to crackle with an energy he hadn't noticed before, a tension that went beyond the danger they had just faced. Trellick's touch was cool against Rick's skin, and despite the alien nature of the Zarnathian, there was an undeniable allure in the way his violet eyes glimmered. "Trellick," Rick said, clearing his throat, "this probably isn't the best time." Trellick's silver scales flushed a deep violet, a sign of embarrassment in Zarnathian culture, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he moved even closer, his voice dropping to a hushed whisper. "I don't understand it, Rick, but there's something about your kind about you. You face death without flinching. You challenge the galaxy's dangers like they're nothing. I've never met anyone who could do that and still smile." Rick could feel his heart racing, not from fear, but from the sheer intensity of Trellick's proximity. The mission, the antimatter reactor, the deadly vortex, all of it seemed to fade into the background. For a brief moment, the only thing that mattered was the two of them, standing amidst the wreckage of their near-death experience. "Trellick, Rick started, but before he could finish, Trellick leaned in, his breath cool against Rick's neck. "This isn't just scientific curiosity," Trellick whispered, his voice soft and intimate. "It's something more." Rick swallowed hard, feeling his body respond in ways he hadn't expected. He had been in plenty of dangerous situations, but nothing quite like this. There was something intoxicating about the way Trellick was looking at him, a mix of admiration, fear, and desire. But Rick wasn't the type to back down from a challenge, even one as unexpected as this. He took a deep breath, his grin returning as he looked into Trellick's violet eyes. "You're not the first alien to say that," Rick said with a chuckle. "Humans have a way of getting under people's skin." Trellick smiled, a small, almost shy gesture that seemed out of place for someone who had just faced a life-threatening situation. But there was something undeniably attractive about his vulnerability, about the way his rigid exterior had melted away in the presence of Rick's audacity. Rick reached up, gently cupping Trellick's chin. Look, I get it. We humans are a mystery to a lot of people. But I've got a rule. Never mix business with whatever this is. Trellick's smile faded slightly, but there was still a glint of hope in his eyes. Then perhaps, when the business is done? Rick paused, considering the offer. The logical part of him screamed that this was a terrible idea, that getting involved with an alien scientist he barely knew was asking for trouble. But another part of him, the part that had signed up for this insane mission in the first place, was intrigued by the challenge, by the possibility of something new and exciting. Maybe, Rick said finally, his voice low and teasing. But first, let's make sure we don't die, yeah? Trellick laughed softly, his tension easing. He took a step back, giving Rick a final, lingering glance before turning back to the rest of the team, who were still packing up the last of the equipment. Rick watched him go, a small smile playing on his lips. The attraction between them was undeniable, but Rick wasn't about to let it distract him from the mission. He had come here to save the galaxy from a catastrophic explosion, not to get lost in a romance with an alien scientist. As Rick rejoined the group, the military officer from earlier approached him, his face unreadable. You handled yourself well, human. Your methods are unconventional but effective. Rick shrugged. That's what we do. Improvisation is kind of our thing. The officer nodded, his expression softening for the first time. Your kind are difficult to understand, but perhaps that's what makes you so valuable. You see things in ways no one else does. Glad you're starting to get it, Rick said with a grin. The shuttle ride back to the base was quiet, the team too exhausted from the day's events to speak much. Rick leaned back in his seat, letting out a long sigh as the adrenaline from the mission finally began to wear off. He glanced over at Trellick, who was seated across from him, his eyes closed, his body finally relaxing after the stress of the mission. Rick smiled to himself. There would be time to figure out what was going on between them later. For now, he was content knowing that they had saved the day, a feat that seemed impossible just hours ago. As the shuttle touched down and the doors opened, the team was greeted with applause from the waiting crowd of officials and scientists. Rick stepped out first, his usual cocky grin firmly in place. Just another Tuesday, he said with a wink to the gathered onlookers. Commander Zerer approached him, his deep red eyes locking onto Rick with a mixture of respect and curiosity. You've done something remarkable today, human. Your bravery, your ingenuity. It's unlike anything we've ever seen. Rick shrugged, still grinning. All in a day's work. But hey, next time you need someone to dive headfirst into another death trap, you know who to call. Zerer offered a faint smile, something that was rare for the typically stoic alien. I'll remember that. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Rick found himself standing alone on the landing pad, the weight of the day's events finally settling in. He had faced down death and come out on top, just like he always did. But something about this mission felt different. It wasn't just the danger or the adrenaline rush. It was the way Trellick had looked at him, the connection they had shared in the midst of chaos. Rick shook his head, chuckling to himself. What a day. As he turned to leave, Trellick approached him once more, his violet eyes shining with the same intensity as before. Rick, about what I said earlier. Rick raised a hand, stopping him. Let's take it slow, all right? One crisis at a time. Trellick smiled, a genuine warm expression that sent a strange thrill through Rick's chest. I can live with that. With a final nod, Rick walked off into the crowd, already thinking about what kind of chaos the next mission would bring. But as he glanced back at Trellick one last time, he couldn't help but wonder if maybe, just maybe, he had found something worth sticking around for. The galaxy was full of danger, full of risks, and full of surprises. And Rick Hansen wouldn't have it any other way.